So, welcome everyone to this Ascential Technology podcast. We have with us Todd Martinson, the Chief Strategy Officer, and Vinod Merchandandi, the Chief Technology Officer. And today we're exploring the topic of cell and gene therapy, which holds enormous amounts of potential for transforming medical treatments. And we're going to talk about what's being done to scale these innovative therapies to reach more patients. So, Todd, let's start with you. Tell us a bit about CGT for people who aren't super familiar with it. Give us a little bit of background about that term and about the kind of therapies that we're talking about.
Well, very simply, CGT has really revolutionized medicine. It really offers hope for cancer, for patients with cancer, autoimmune diseases, as well as rare genetic disorders. In particular, today we're going to talk a lot about CAR T cell therapy and what that is. And just to cover that real quick, there's two types of CAR T cell therapies right now. There's autologous that uses the patient's blood, and then there's allogeneic, which uses a donor patient's blood. For the conversation today, we'll be talking more about autologous CAR T cell therapy. And back to the therapy. What has been approved by the FDA right now is several treatments that treat different types of blood cancer. So this could include B-cell lymphomas, multiple myelomas, and certain types of leukemias. Those treatments have actually been approved and are on the market right now, and we'll discuss that a little bit. So what is CAR T cell therapy? As I mentioned, it does take the patient's blood, and then depending upon what type of treatment is provided, the T cells are separated from the blood, and then you add customized CARs. And now what are CARs? They're chimeric antigen receptors, and those are specialized receptors that are added to the T cells, and those receptors then attack the different types of cancer that the patient has. So it is a bespoke, customized treatment. So after those CARs are added to the T cells of the donor blood or the patient's blood, the next step in the process is that blood is then grown, right, through incubators so that it multiplies the number of T cells. After that blood is multiplied enough to be able to treat the patient, that blood is then introduced back into the patient through a transfusion, and hopefully that will solve the patient's issues, be it cancer or other issues you're trying to solve. The fantastic part of CAR T cell therapy is that the cure rates of some of these applications are up to the 90-95% mark. And that's why there's such excitement about CAR T cell therapy.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really exciting. So there's a huge amount of promise with these technologies. So what are the challenges that are being faced in getting these into the clinic? As you've said, there's a bunch of these that are approved, that are on the market. But is the wider industry ready to support this new kind of technology at scale?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's actually several challenges happening right now, even though we've got some of these great applications approved. And by the way, I failed to mention that although there are a few approved, there's over 1,000 different clinical trials and drugs in process right now using CAR T cell therapy. So that gives you a little bit of the scope of what's happening right now. But back to your question about the challenges. First of all, scalability is a huge challenge. Because this is a bespoke treatment, the idea of scaling any of these treatments becomes a bit of a challenge. And we'll talk a little bit about that because the manufacturing is slow, it's complex, and it does involve many, many, many steps when you're using the traditional way of creating the CAR T cell therapy. So that's one. And for an example, in 2020, there was 500,000 patients that would have been eligible for the CAR T cell therapies that had been approved. Only 3,000 doses were actually delivered to those patients that were eligible. So that's less than a 0.6% treatment rate of those therapies that had been approved. And that goes directly to the fact that the scalability of this manufacturing has not yet really been found yet or discovered for these therapies. The second thing is the cost, right? Because there's not scalability, because it's bespoke, and because all of this workflow still takes several steps and a lot of time for that matter, the cost to the patient ranges somewhere between $300,000 to $450,000 per dose for these therapies. So that's not only for the patient, but for the entire healthcare system. Now, remember, we are in a lot of ways solving for cancer. So a lot of people would trade that in a lot more money to be able to solve cancer. But that is an incredibly high cost that doesn't really allow the CAR T cell therapies now to go to the masses. So that's a problem. And finally, it's timing. Because it's a bespoke treatment and because it's being aimed, particularly when we're talking autologous, we have to take the patient's blood and then add the treatment. It can take as much as 21 days from vein to vein to actually create this treatment and put it back into the patient. And that can be fatal at times because these drugs are approved as refractory or relapsed. The time in which we're going after these patients and treating them is only after many, if not all, other treatments have failed. So taking 21 to 28 days to be able to get these treatments to the patient sometimes can cause the patient to pass before you're able to complete the treatment. So those are three of the biggest hurdles that still face our system and treating our patients with CAR T cell therapy today.
Mm-hmm. So when you say, you're talking about the cost and the time involved in manufacturing these things, what is it about CAR T therapies that make them so difficult to manufacture, and particularly manufacturing at scale? Can you unpack sort of the stages that are involved in that process and what makes it so difficult?
Sure. First of all, it is a bespoke, customized treatment, right? And so in order to scale these, we haven't yet standardized all the systems to be able to do that. For a corollary, when you're creating a drug or a pill, that becomes a standardized process across the board. Since each one of these therapies are individualized, then you have to standardize the system all throughout, not only the workflow and the process, but quality control, standardization, testing, and such. And then you've got to standardize where you're producing this, right? And that is a challenge we'll talk about later in this discussion, which is how can you take this personalized treatment and where is the between massively producing it and customizing it at the local level. So that makes it very difficult. Obviously, because you're dealing with T cells, which are very complex, you've got to grow those T cells. So it takes 7 to 10 days to do that. The testing takes 7 to 10 days. Because there are so many steps in the workflow right now that haven't been completely standardized across all these treatments, you also have the potential for errors and problems with that. In addition to that, standardized tools and processes, as I mentioned earlier, are a problem. You have multiple different tools and processes from multiple different companies and multiple different people applying those. And again, that introduces risk to the system. So for all of those reasons and more, those are the challenges. Now, the key question really comes to how do we scale CGT manufacturing to reduce the cost well below the $400,000 range, keep the quality where it needs to be, reducing the vein-to-vein time, and allowing that to serve the masses and really maybe have the ability to solve cancer, right? That really is the key question, how we can scale this but keep the bespoke nature of this.
Yeah, definitely. So clearly, I think introducing automation into the manufacturing process is going to form a big part of the solution here. Vinod, can you tell us a bit about Ascential's work in this area in general? A bit of an introduction, and how some of your work can be applied to these challenges in CAR T manufacturing that Todd was talking about.
Yeah, certainly. So, Todd mentioned, I think, several times about how complex this workflow is. Multiple steps, there are more than 50 steps. And if you ever go to the CGNT or basically a cell and gene therapy manufacturing site, especially the one that is doing it manually, you'll see there's many skilled technicians along the way that are there. So if you're trying to scale that, it becomes pretty difficult to do because you have multiple steps and you have multiple skilled technicians, you need a lot of training, and you're just scaling that is just not. So automation is an obvious solution. And, at Ascential, that's kind of what we do for a living. That's really our sweet spot. In fact, if you take a look, we have expertise in custom engineering, in custom automation solutions for manufacturing of medical devices. We also have expertise in custom automation for drug and device combinations in a CGMP environment. All these sort of expertise or areas of expertise help us position ourselves really well to support a cell and gene therapy provider, a solution provider. So we're actually a good partner to work with. One big example that we have, in fact, for the last several years, we've been working with one of the leading cell and gene therapy provider, very innovative solution that uses closed solutions and robotics to help scale manufacturing. A good success story there. We also have a lot of experience with robotics, by the way. This is part of the automation world. And as you can imagine, whenever you have manual steps, it makes it quite obvious that you need to try to figure out how you can eliminate these manual steps with robotics. And we do that very well at Ascential. We can take a complicated workflow and automate it with robots quite well.
Excellent. So I know part of the work that you do in this sort of environment is moving from open systems to closed systems. So can you talk about what you mean by a closed system when you talk about that, and how that differs? How that differs from the more sort of typical automated procedure that people might imagine?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. The open system is what is typically described as the manual process, where there's a lot of manual intervention. And actually, just to simplify it, open and closed system, the difference is the biological material doesn't get exposed to any contamination. That's really what it is. And what people have done is they've taken, a open system and closed it at a unit operation level. So there's multiple steps, multiple pieces of process equipment. You can take two of them, you combine them, and make sure that they don't have any human intervention, and the biological material is never exposed to any source of contamination, keeping it sterile. So I think that's really the difference between an open and closed system.
Mm-hmm. So moving to this sort of, adding automation to the process, going to a closed system, what's the impact that has ultimately for patients, in bringing these therapies to the market? And have you got any examples of sort of case studies that you're able to share with us?
Yeah, so obviously once you move to a closed system and you keep your product sterile, there's a huge advantage that Todd was mentioning earlier about, the time it takes to create this dose of therapy for one patient is personalized, maybe 20, 21 days. Imagine if the source of biological material is contaminated for some reason, just because you have an open system. It delays the access to that particular medicine or that therapy for the patient. And that could be life-threatening. So it's important to have these closed systems, and it's important for us to actually develop a system that ensures that the end product is completely sterile. There are many companies that are doing this already. Examples are Cytivia, Lonza, Stellaris, and we've also seen companies where they've taken the individual process equipment and they've closed it by basically putting them in clean environments, and then had an external robot that goes and interacts with them and moves the material from one process equipment to the other, right? And then that's entirely in a closed system too. So that's some of the solutions that we've seen out there. And it's a rapidly emerging trend, and there's more solutions that will show up with that approach.
Yeah, excellent. Sterility itself, obviously that's always important to some extent when we're talking about sort of, pharmaceutical manufacturing. But what's especially challenging or especially important about sterility when we're dealing with CAR T therapies?
Yeah. So sterility is completely non-negotiable in this process. The end product is a live biological. You basically have cells. You can't sterilize them without damaging them. So what you have to do is you have to design your entire process so that you create this aseptic manufacturing system, and where every one of these process pieces of equipment are actually sterilized, so that as the sample goes from the patient sample all the way to becoming a product that goes back into the patient, it remains sterile. So it's super, super critical. At Ascential, what we have is engineering and global sourcing expertise, where we actually have the ability to procure and specify robots, clean room, process equipment, and other pieces of equipment that go into this manufacturing process that can withstand disinfectants or hydrogen peroxide, this vaporized hydrogen peroxide that are used to sterilize equipment. So we know how to specify this, we know how to source them, and that's what makes it important. So once you bring all that, you put it all in a clean environment, now you ensure that your end product is going to be a sterile product. And this is back to contamination free, making sure there's less human intervention. All these things are super important. And if the release process, since every product is really a process, and interestingly enough, I often hear the process is the product, because once you go through the process, you're producing a unique product. it needs its own batch records, it needs its own release QC. So there are multiple steps why sterility is actually important to ensure that when you end up at the end product, you've got a really good product and you ensure that it's very safe for the customer, for the patient.
So how does this tie into your quality control approach as well? Because obviously that's a big part of this kind of manufacturing. Is that something that can be automated too?
Yeah, there's an emerging trend. I mean, right now what people do is, since there are so many steps, between every step you have to do some form of QC. And when you do that QC, you actually pull some of the biological material out, which means you got human intervention and you also take some of the more valuable cells away from the actual product. So what you need to do is try to develop inline QC, continuous real-time monitoring of the product as it goes through. This is happening. We see more innovation in this area. At Ascential, we obviously have a lot of experience with imaging and sensor applications and electronics to pull all this kind of information together. We also have the data collection. And so we can actually support the development of these inline QC systems. Additionally, we also have developed some software which actually can do some process analytics, which will help with the QC and batch records, etc.
Mm-hmm. And does that tie into regulatory compliance as well? With this being quite a young family of therapies, often that means that the requirements are more strict, even more strict than usual.
Yes,
and
yeah.
Obviously with it being a live therapy as well, that there'll be additional things. So that will be a big concern for people manufacturing this stuff, right?
Exactly. It's live therapy, it's live biological, and it's like every process, like I said, is a product. So you only have one shot at it, right? And then you get this product. And from a regulatory perspective, you have to provide a batch record for each one of these therapies that you create. So it's not like for the same one, you just do it once. No, every time you go through the process, you have to create a batch record. So it's like a little book. And if you have these inline QC approaches, all electronic, it makes that particular process really easy. So it allows, from a regulatory perspective, traceability, auditability, ensuring that we're actually complying with all the regulatory requirements. So this closed system, inline QC, automation, all go towards helping with the regulatory process and simplifying it quite a bit.
Awesome. So, in this sort of overall drive that we're looking at of, looking for better availability of these therapies for patients, basically, where does the concept of decentralized manufacturing come into? I know another thing that you guys talk about. Again, give us a bit of background. What does that mean? What are you talking about when we talk about decentralizing manufacturing, and what impacts do you think it will have on this particular part of the industry?
Correct. If you look at traditional ways that the industry approaches pharmaceuticals or treatments such as this, the traditional way of doing this is going into mega factories, singular locations, either globally or regionally located in continents to treat the patient. We are actually agnostic as a firm on CAR T-cell therapy and how that's done. But based on everything we've discussed earlier, there is an opportunity to not only look at the mega factories as an option, but to also look at regionalization of treatments with CGT as well as CAR T-cell therapy. So that may mean certain providers might want to provide the therapies in mega factories. They might want to provide the therapies regionally within regions of the US or Europe or Asia. They might even want to go within the cities or even more localized than that. From our perspective, we're agnostic and we'd love to help out our partners wherever they would like to do that. And we have the capabilities to do so.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense, talking about going to these more regional, more sort of more local systems, particularly with this kind of therapy. Like you said, when there's a long lead time around the manufacturing, the closer to the patient that they can be when they're manufacturing these, the easier that's going to be. That does make sense. So does that tie in with what Vinod was talking about before about these closed systems? Does that make it easier going to that sort of system? Does that make it easier to bring these closer to patients?
I think in order to bring it close to patients, you must have closed systems, right? For all of the reasons Vinod outlined as far as quality control, as far as scalability, the only way to regionalize is to have these systems be closed and repeatable. And if you can manage that, even though these are customized bespoke treatment, those closed systems allow you to become more regionalized and give that option to our partners and the options to the patients and the hospitals and the physicians that are treating those patients. And so those closed systems combined with the automation that's involved in them allows multiple pathways to deliver CAR T-cell therapy in the future to the patients.
Excellent. So what's your vision for the future, over the coming few years as these things expand, as more of these therapies get approved? What do you think is the single biggest change that needs to happen for this kind of therapy to really scale?
Well, I think there's a lot of changes that need to happen, but I think the way that we're leading the charge is really our experience in automation. We believe automation and standardization with robotics and quality by design strategies are the key to this. We have 40 years of expertise, not only working in automation, but also working in medical and life sciences, working on not only instruments, but drug treatments and the like. And we believe that we can help lead the way with our partners to bring that expertise in automation and robotics. In partnering with CGT manufacturers, we will be able to help them and work in partnership with them to implement scalable and closed system solutions that can allow us to get closer to the patient and allow those patients to be treated in a more efficacious and more quality-driven manner than really is existing right now. And finally, we really look to help partner with companies to help them meet their regulatory requirements while improving the affordability by being closer to the patient. So we believe our history, not only for the past 40 years of working with our partners, but also our experience in CGT over the last 3 to 5 years, kind of uniquely positions us to be able to help our partners to treat these patients in a better manner.
Excellent. All right, that was fascinating. So thanks so much, both of you, for sharing these insights. It's really exciting to think about where all this could lead.